So, wholeheartedly welcome to my European colleagues and USA colleagues to this transatlantic dialogue where we are going to talk about sustainable finance. A special welcome, of course, to SEEC who is the host of for the House Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition. And then, of course, special welcome to Emmanuel Faber and Bob Litterman, who are the speakers, very established and renowned, knowledgeable people about sustainable finance. And before I give the floor to Jean and to Paul Tang, who is my good colleague, we worked for a very long time, very intensively across the political parties to implement the agenda of sustainable finance. I'll just briefly say that there's a very broad agenda ahead of us. You and USA have your own challenges, knowing that even in some places like Texas, the whole idea of sustainable finance is challenged. And we actually should be having a coherent framework of how do we measure, where do we get the information, and what are the standards in ESG, in sustainable finance, and what is green and what is significant harm. And the EU has done quite a set of legislation and been sort of the road opener in this issue and pushing the international agenda in IPCF, the platform Sustainable Finance. But we have very good colleagues and contacts in USA, very initial good discussions with China about how to start aligning the taxonomy. So what do we actually mean by sustainability and green? We have our own efforts in the EU, sometimes successful, sometimes not so successful, but we probably come back on that. And then, of course, the big issues is how we can push across the Atlantic this very effective international framework that is under work on ISSB in context of the work that is done on IFRS, so having a global framework. And then as my personal notice, I just would like to drop the idea that we would need to have a beholder, be it ISSB or something else, about the methodologies, how to count the life cycle analysis, CO2 footprints, and where do we get the very reliable information by the UN and the UN, different UN organs that then can be shared and used by everybody. But with these words, very eager to hear the comments from your side, and then I'll give the floor to Paul for introductory comments. And first, Jean Casten, happy to have you with us, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I cannot stress enough how appreciative I am for all that you all do. I've lost track of how many times we've met with you, but it is so important to keep this conversation going. And I want to put some numbers on how important that is, because my general view, which I think is shared by our investment caucus and certainly others on our side of the aisle in the House, is that you cannot meaningfully affect climate change without dealing with finance, both from a reporting perspective and from the economic effects of that movement. Because really committing to clean energy means really committing to cheap energy, which means a massive wealth transfer, arguably the biggest in the history of our species, from energy producers to energy consumers. I want to give you some numbers on that. The United States has a little over a $20 trillion economy. We consume about 100 quadrillion BTUs of primary energy a year, not fossil energy, total primary energy, everything from falling water and nuclear fuel to coal. That means that we have an economy that produces about $200 for every million BTU. The UK produces $360 per million BTU. Switzerland produces almost 600, which means that if the United States were to be just as good as the UK is at turning primary energy into useful economic activity, we could almost double our economy without a single additional ton of CO2. If that doesn't completely embarrass and shock you, you're not following the story. I'd like to believe we could be even better than the UK, but this is a practical reality. That's a positive thing. We could be richer, we could have our cake and eat it too. You can see the private sector already starting to do that. Go and look at the price earnings ratios of First Energy or Tesla or NextEra. Compare those to the price earning ratios of companies like Exxon, Chevron, General Motors. There's almost a 10x, sometimes more than a 10x difference in the multiple that capital markets are willing to pay to companies who are investing in technologies that American consumers want, as opposed to the ones that are subsidized that can't compete in that world. And looked at from one perspective, that's really positive. Looked at from the perspective of the stability of our financial system, that in a nutshell explains why the Appalachian economy is collapsing, because they are committed to technologies that cannot attract capital. As my friend Jigar Shah once said to a panel of bankers, if you're only trading at a 7x multiple, which is essentially what Exxon's trading at, you're not failing to invest in new wells and new development because you're greedy. You're failing to invest in new wells and new development because you are bad at business and capital markets don't like you. What does that do to the Gulf Coast? What does it do? You're nervous about what might happen in a world that goes away from oil if that means huge numbers of unemployed young men in places like Iran, places like Russia. We should also be, if we want to know what that looks like to have large numbers of unemployed young men, look at politically what's happening in Appalachia. Ask yourself what happens in places like the Gulf Coast. Those are real things we have to be concerned about. And of course, there are also the very real financial issues that I think we talk about more often when insurance companies stop insuring properties in California and Florida and Louisiana, when banks start pulling capital out of those areas because they don't want to invest in a property with a 30-year mortgage if that area is going to be underwater in 20 years, as is true for much of the Gulf Coast. And so those are real things that are happening, and we're blind to much of this in part because our global financial regulators don't pay nearly as much attention to disruptions in our economic system that aren't within the four corners of their regulatory mandate in the banking system. We saw that in the 2008 crisis when, as long as it was insured by AIG, it was stable. We're in part blind to it because I think we don't like to tell ourselves that the energy markets don't allocate capital as efficiently as we were taught in our freshman macroeconomics textbook says that our free market capitalist system works. And we're partly blind to it because we just don't have good rules. And this was really the genesis of creating our Sustainable Investment Caucus, is that we don't, in financial accounting, it's axiomatic that you account for every dollar, that every side of the ledger has a balancing entry on the other side of the ledger, all liabilities equal all assets. Every debit has a credit. There's still a debate going on in carbon accounting. Should we double count carbon? Should we include scope 3 if that double counts with scope 1? How do we tie that out? What does that mean if we're thinking about how to allocate our portfolio in ways that insulate us from that risk if investors want to do that? And it is critically important that we do that. Hopefully I've gone through enough wonky detail to prove what I said at the start. I am so grateful that you all are doing what we're doing, because this conversation, if done well, means that we get the math right, which means that we get the disclosure right, which means that capital markets can start to efficiently allocate capital, which means that we do not have to worry about a conflict between a world that wants cheaper energy, a world that wants cleaner energy, and a world that doesn't want to go through a bunch of financial dislocation on the route to that goal. So I'm grateful for what you do. I'm delighted with the panel. I say this with no false praise. There are a few people who have thought longer and harder about this than Bob Letterman, and you're fortunate to have him on the panel as well. And thanks so much for the time and the event.
Thank you, Sam, for your very inspiring words. I can endorse all of them. And I took note of quite some of your comments, and I think that we are very in line about the analysis, what is the situation in different parts of the world, and hopefully we can push together the changes. But now, Paul Tang, for your introductory comments, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sirpa, and thank you, Representative Sean Costin, for this very wonderful introduction. Indeed, what we have in common is the challenge to transform our society and economy. And that requires investment by the companies, but also financing of this investment. And this is what brings us together. And it's very good to have this meeting and these excellent speakers. And it's a daunting task because if we just look at reporting alone, the financial reporting has already an industry of accountants, auditors, controllers, and we try to build a framework next to it, making sure that we see what the impact of on people and planet is. That is a daunting task, but certainly not impossible. But the proof is in the eating of the pudding. I was happy to hear that Representative Sean Costin also mentioned the capital market, because this is where, when I speak about proof is in the eating of the pudding, will the capital flow to those companies that start to green themselves or are already green? That's the basic question. And just last week we saw that, for example, an example of oil, the Shell company, announced to cut back expenditure on sustainable investment, wind energy, and indeed the stock price went up. And that makes you wonder, is the capital market up to the task? Because the textbook is, it will go to the most productive end, but that is not always very clear, especially if that productive end is of a public nature and lies far into the future. We need to fight short-termism, for example. So I think reporting and disclosure is important. It's an important first step. We have different approaches, I think, with the difference between financial and full materiality. I don't think they should matter in that sense. I very much hope they would sort of be on the same line. They would be complements to each other. I think that's the first job that we need to complete. But we also need to focus more on making the long-term visible. And I think that's why it's very important that if you have transition plans so that the companies can show how to reach their zero pledges and to make their commitments indeed credible, but also to help investors to make decisions, because it's a long path. It's from 2023 up to 2050. 27 years, a lot may happen. So we need to focus very much in the years to come on credible transition plans that are done by the companies, but also help investors to guide decisions. Again, we have a wonderful panel. I try to keep it short, Sirpa, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Paul. I think it is very good that you underlined the fact that we need to have this kind of a mirroring of the accounting principles and reporting principles and liability principles of financial sector finances to environmental and social aspects of what is done. So make the externalities visible. And then the big question is how to do it, because we have, as far as I know, about 250 different standards and accounting mechanisms about sustainability, and so there's not the comparability. And that's why I'm very happy to introduce and invite Emmanuel Faber, the chair of ISSB, the inaugural chair, actually, of International Sustainability Standards Board from effective from 22. And you are well known about your passion for sustainability and leadership positions at multinational food products company Danone. And now guide us, what are your thinking, how we should proceed, and what is the state of preparations? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sirpa, and thank you all for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure, Paul, to see you here again after conversations we had at the EU Parliament about 12 months ago. I think there is some background noise. Maybe I could suggest that those who do not speak might just mute themselves for the overall comfort here. That would be great. Thank you, colleagues. The point is that there is something missing, basically, and there was. And you just highlighted, Sirpa, the number of ESG standards or references that exist. The ISSB has been created as part of the IFRS Foundation that is providing accounting standards in about 140 jurisdictions now, to create a language, not only metrics or colors or numbers or AAAs or whatever that is, ratings, a language, a quasi-accounting, financially literate language that would express what Sean was just mentioning before, or what Paul was referencing in terms of getting the market to work, because we are here to uh, link the financial statements with the risks and opportunities that relate in sustainability topics by opening and trying to solve the tragedy of horizons that Mark Carney a long time ago spoke about, which is opening to the full value chains. And you were referring to the life cycle analysis earlier, for instance. So we require that the full value chains be scanned for material information, and second, the full horizon space of short, mid, and long term, with the connection of current and anticipated effects on financial statements of those risks and opportunities. So we are here to essentially consolidate that framework where there is an alphabet soup and to end the alphabet soup. We were supported by the G20 and the Financial Stability Board. We are actually have consolidated a framework called TCFD that is heavily used in Europe and heavily used in the US actually by many companies in the US, which is focused on climate financial disclosures. And the Financial Stability Board of the G20 has now determined that after our first standards, S1 and S2, which is about climate S2, were established last summer, they culminated the work of the TCFD task force. We now have the legacy of the TCFD task force, and we're going to monitor on behalf of the Financial Stability Board and the prudential supervisors and regulators, the implementation of those corporate climate disclosures around the world. The ISSB standards have been endorsed by IOSCO in July. IOSCO is the International Organization of Securities Commissions, and the SEC is part of them, of course. The EU, FISMA, and others are observers and part of as well. So an essential mechanism that covers about 130 jurisdictions, 95% of global capitalization. And our standards have been declared fit for purpose by regulators, market participants, investors, and companies to use in order to ensure that there is transparency on the overall sustainability risks and opportunities, but starting with climate. So in essence, we believe that there is an opportunity to really put at work, as Sean was referring earlier, the capital markets in funding the transition. What is missing today is that financially literate language that can be decision useful for investors, because tomorrow, indeed, we would expect that a company that is not as climate resilient as another company in the same sector will have a higher cost of capital and will therefore lose competitiveness, and therefore, and obviously, share price and other aspects would be affected negatively. So as much as you do profit warnings today, maybe in 5 years down the road, you will be doing carbon warnings or climate warnings because you're late compared to your competitors or compared to the commitments that you've made, because you need to make more investments, more innovation, more upskilling of your workforce to pivot the company. So this is what we've started to do. A number of jurisdictions have already mentioned their interest. The UK is one, Japan, Korea, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Brazil, Nigeria, and many others. Interestingly, of course, I do spend a lot of time in both jurisdictions, the US and EU, and I can tell you, your group is an incredibly important group of leaders, political leaders, to drive the convergence behind and support of not only climate, but beyond that, the transition that is needed. So most of my time is actually spent discussing in the US with business organizations, regulators, and others how we can ensure that where the US is going to land is going to be compatible with the gap agnostic view of ISSB and contribute to the global language that we're seeking to put in place to avoid the fragmentation and the fact that once it's fragmented, there is no way that capital markets can actually work on that. And the same way in EU, I can tell you, we spent a lot of time with our colleagues at FISMA and EFRAG to reach this point of interoperability that we have now between the global baseline and Europe, which is frankly an incredible gift to the overall good, public good of capital markets, because it means now that Europe is incorporated in the global baseline, and conversely, ISSB preparers internationally are well placed to fulfill the ESRS requirements at a lower cost and with interesting decision usefulness for investors. In particular, in climate, and I will stop here, on climate, we have reached a level of alignment that both the Commission and ourselves, on the 31st of July, when the delegated acts were finalized, we both mentioned that they were highly aligned on climate. And we're currently finalizing the navigation tool between the two. But I heard Sean, and I guess others would say, what about scope 3 and everything? We require scope 3 because this is where there is a lot of transition risks, in particular in jurisdictions like Europe, which have this minus 55% ambition by 2030 that do create, for any company selling or doing business in Europe, a transition risks on the lower end of its supply chain anyway, or its value chain. So I'll finish with that, but this cooperation between US and EU has been an obsession for us. And I'm so happy that you've been working for so much time for that. And I'll finish by saying we provide the very granular language, the grammar and the syntax of how all of this is working, which is even below the financial taxonomies or the taxonomies that Europe has put in place. We're providing the granular language that allows that taxonomy to be based on meaningful information to then guide where finance can go and should go. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Emmanuel, and the good news what you gave. Actually, 95% of the capital under these auspices sounds very great and promising in the future. And now it is our roles in both parliaments, in the Congress and EU Parliament, to try to secure and push this development. And actually the good news I hope that we all could bear in mind is that we have roughly, if I recall it correctly, 70 trillion in movable capital globally, and 30 trillion of it is on unsustainable and significant harm investments. And it is not the reason because of the investors would like to destroy the world, but because they do not have the information. So the good news is that we know what is the problem, we know what to do, we have the technology and companies, and yes, surprise, surprise, if we can guide it correctly, we do have the money also. So a bit of this kind of a bright moment in this climate crisis. Emmanuel, please do continue.
Yeah, so, sorry, Sepa, I just wanted to add to what you said and then I stop. Indeed, I mean, the global equity market capitalization is about 100 trillion, sorry. If you add debt, that's actually 400. So just look at equity. We've all heard that to effect a just transition, and just is so important because socially, otherwise it will not happen. Politically, it will not happen. So just transition requires 2 trillion every year. So if through the language that we're developing and many other efforts, we can move 2% of the total equity value around the world, we would be able to fund through markets without more public money and government money being spent, other than creating the incentives with their public policy. We could do that. Of course, that would mean everyone is part of that, but imagine only maybe 30, 40, 50% of capitalization countries and jurisdictions are involved, and you already get probably half of that. So I'm stopping here, but this is to say we don't have much time. We really need to put action and momentum behind this, but it is still doable.
Thank you, and thank you for the great news. I'll be using it in the future. Actually, 2%, and nowadays we are complaining about the money, how much and how incredible cost the climate actions would be. And actually, it's nitty-gritty if we just have the right guidance. Our next speaker is very renowned person also, Bob Litterman, the chairman of a risk committee and founding partner of Kepos Capital. So now we are looking at it from the risk and capital perspective. You are founding partner of the capital, and you prior that you have worked with Goldman Sachs and quite extensively on investment side. And your background is in economics in USA. But now, what could you tell us what to do and what is the stake?
Thank you very much. First of all, I agree with everything that has been said. Getting the right information is so important. But I want to go to a little bit deeper into this, and if we could bring up my slides, I think that's going to happen now.
We can hear you and we can see you.
I want to bring the slides. Okay, there we go.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay, great. Perfect. And then if you can just go to, I don't see the slide yet, so I'm just going to wait. But I will say while we're waiting for the slide that, my background is risk management. I was a financial engineer for many years on Wall Street, and climate change is the risk management problem. It's the failure of our generation, and we're not moving fast enough. As Emmanuel said, we need strong incentives to reduce emissions. They need to be globally harmonized. There we go. Go to the next slide. Perfect. There we go. I think Emmanuel mentioned we need trillions of dollars more. I think the International Energy Agency estimates that we need $3 trillion per year invested in low carbon capital, infrastructure, manufacturing. And that's like 3 times the current level. And much of the current investment is funded by government subsidies and philanthropic capital, and that's just not enough. Clearly, market expectations of returns to investment in low carbon capital are much too low. And we know why that's the case. The IMF has told us many times that there are huge global subsidies to fossil fuels. They just updated their estimates for 2020 this summer, and they estimated that $7 trillion of global subsidies to fossil fuels. Obviously, we have to eliminate those subsidies. And right now, we have to change expectations about the elimination of those future subsidies. It's expectations that drive capital. And I think there's a way to use financial engineering to create credible expectations that future incentives will be there to price carbon. Consider TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. This is a very simple example of financial engineering that allows the Federal Reserve to have credibility in fighting inflation. I was at the Fed 40 years ago when we were trying to tame inflation in the late 70s. And we were looking backwards at money supply numbers. And then we would react to that. And it was creating a lot of noise. Under, I guess it was Secretary Robert Rubin, the U.S. to these inflation-protected securities. What they do is they illuminate market expectations of inflation. And we can do the same thing with carbon pricing. We can do a bond, I call it a carbon-linked bond, that incorporates and reveals expectations of future carbon price. Now, one of the problems is that we have to look at carbon pricing. It comes in many forms. If we go to the next slide, my firm, Kepos Capital, and another firm, Grow Intelligence, intelligence have been computing for a number of years now the market incentives to reduce emissions. And it's a very sad picture. What you see on this slide is for the orange bars are the strength of the incentives to reduce emissions. Spain at the top at $130 per ton. Then you see the UK, France, Netherlands, Germany. These are all European countries. They have strong incentives to reduce emissions. And then you see the blue bars. They hardly show up there at the top. Those are the amount of emissions per country. Now, if you go down to the middle of the slide, you see a line that touches. You see the global emissions bar is huge, and you see the global average price is $18, $18.50. Not surprisingly, the big global emitters, including the United States, China, India, they all are in the middle of that graph where the incentives to reduce emissions are much too low. The United States has incentives to reduce emissions below the global average. And then you see at the bottom of this slide a number of countries, particularly in the Middle East, Russia, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, that have negative incentives. They have fixed prices for fossil fuels that are below the marginal cost. And so they're actually subsidizing pollution in the UAE, where we're going to have the COP in a few weeks, minus $3 a ton, because they had in 2021 fixed prices for gasoline. And this is just unacceptable. The lack of harmonization, the fact that the incentive is much too low. You know, the IMF estimate of fossil fuel subsidies uses a social cost of carbon of $60 a ton, and they still get $7 trillion of subsidies. If you use Resources for the Future, a US-based think tank that I think has the best estimate, it's $185 a ton. It's over $11 trillion of subsidies to fossil fuels. This is a hurricane force wind in our face as we're trying to move forward. We go to the next slide. There are a number of different types of policies that lead up to these incentives. So you can see across the top here, you have fossil fuel subsidies, carbon taxes, emissions trading systems, fossil fuel taxes, feed-in tariffs, low carbon fuel standards, and renewable portfolio standards. And in different countries, we have a different mix of policies. So you have to look across all of these policies. And then you notice in the column that's colored blue, you have fossil fuel subsidies. Every country in the world has some degree of fossil fuel subsidies. And so they go in the wrong direction. But basically what you see here, particularly in the United States, is a lack of policy to reduce emissions. And in fact, 90% of the incentive in the US, which is much too low, comes from gasoline taxes. And basically those were not designed to reduce pollution, they were designed to build roads. So what you have is really a lack of policy in the United States. And because of that lack of incentive, we get too little investment in low carbon infrastructure. Go to the next slide now. Okay, now how do these carbon linked bonds work? Well, they would index the coupon and principal to the difference between a country's stated carbon price intention at a given date in the future and its actual subsequent policy. So first of all, when you issue a carbon linked bond, you would include in it a targeted path, which you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, going forward. Basically, you're saying, this is what I'm going to do. And on the left-hand side, what you see is if you actually hit your target, you get the coupon that you would have gotten otherwise in a nominal bond. But if you hit it, you pay less. If you don't hit it, if you don't reach your target, then you have to pay more. So what does this do? This creates an incentive for government to hit their targeted policy, becomes less expensive for them. Now, the most important thing that this does is it provides an opportunity for investors to hedge the risk that the government won't hit its stated policy. So basically, it gives a forward curve in carbon prices. So just as in the United States now with TIPS, you can hedge inflation risk by entering into a contract linked to a TIPS bond What you can do with there were carbon-linked bonds is you could indeed lock in a forward carbon price that is promised by the government. And finally, what this does is it creates observability. It allows the market's expected forward price to be visible, and that allows a government to create more credibility. So just like the Fed today, faced with inflationary expectations caused by the COVID supply crunch and so on, and the monetary response, the Fed sees those inflationary expectations, reacts quickly enough so that it has credibility because those expectations are observable, that it can respond and therefore get inflation back under control. And the same thing could happen here, where you get governments announcing forward pricing of emissions and then having credible policies to hit them. That creating the credibility that in the capital markets causes investors to invest in these low carbon capital. If we go to the final slide, the bottom line is that we absolutely have to highlight the path that we're going to take to eliminate these carbon subsidies. We don't have appropriate incentives today. We don't have appropriate investment in the capital markets. Of course, information and disclosure is important, but if we don't get these incentives, and frankly, Europe is way ahead of us in the United States, if we don't get these incentives and don't say we're going to create these incentives, credibly, we won't get the investment in capital that we need. A 2 or 3 times increase is what we need, and we need it immediately. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And that highlights very well the fact that the sustainable finance is, of course, the metering, and it is the investment side and the company disclosure, but it is also the public subsidies and the impact of that, and we should phase out that, and that links this, of course, with the beyond the GDP modeling, what is underway under UN at the moment. So how we measure publicly our GDP and our budgets, and that hopefully could go to credit rating agencies when you rate countries and companies in the longer run. But now let's go to discussion, and I'll hand over to Paul to open floor for the debate and discussion. Please, Paul.
Yes, and I would ask the participants to raise their hands so we can take the floor. And I also will ask you, in view of the time, you have to make one point, right? We can't do the whole discussion, and because I see so many people that I would love to hear, but just make a very clear point. And before we start with raising the hands, I would like to give the floor to Helena Fieres-Vestias. What is in store? You're the chair of the Sustainable Finance Platform. Or what is in store? Maybe good to tell that also to our American colleagues. What can we expect given the issues that have been addressed up to now?
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So very quickly, in terms of what the work that we're doing together with the European Commission, for those of you that do not know the platform, the EU Platform Sustainable Finance, we are the advisory stakeholder group that advises the European Commission on the development of the EU taxonomy, but also on the wider sustainable finance framework. I would say that what we're working on is primarily on, number one, reinforce the consistency and try to simplify the regulatory framework. It's important to understand that the different pieces of regulation were negotiated separately and developed. So now that we have the main building blocks, we're looking at them and say, okay, how do we enhance the effectiveness of the entire framework? So that's definitely one of our priorities. The second one is the usability of the EU taxonomy. And that goes from looking at how to improve the criteria, so it's easy to apply it, to also looking at how it interacts with the different pieces of the regulation to really fulfill the purpose of the taxonomy, which is to mobilize capital flows towards sustainable investments. If I were to say that what the holy grail is in this area, knowing that, saying holy grail, it's a little bit risky. I would say there's what I call the triangle of all virtues, which is transition plans, credible, detailed transition plans on one hand, and then on the other hand, CapEx alignment on the taxonomy, so that at asset level we start actually not only directing the investment flows to become taxonomy aligned, but also that we start providing much more detailed information to investors and financiers at asset level, which is complementary to transition level. Another way of looking at it is to say transition plans are forward-looking. It's almost like a promise, and what the CapEx alignment indicator does, together with the annual reporting of greenhouse gas emissions reductions in absolute terms and verified, it gives you the proof that actually a company is putting its money where the mouth is, that it actually is delivering on the transition plan. And I think that the link between the three is absolutely key. So we're working also on making the transitioned piece within the European framework a much more prominent, looking at where the gaps might be and providing, recommendations in that area. Last but not least, we are continuing to develop further the taxonomy, because this is all about the international angle. Very quickly, I would say, if I have 2 more minutes, 3 things. The first one is that we are looking at improving the operability of the EU taxonomy for non-EU players and for EU players that operate outside. So that would be one. Secondly, that we are equally planning to provide guidance on the use of estimates for those companies that do not report on taxonomy, so that financial institutions and financial market participants can calculate the degree of sustainability of the financial products and instruments with the taxonomy. And last but not least, we are expanding the taxonomy to cover many more activities, including those that might be fall into what we call transitional. I had one ask, and I'm going to take advantage that Emmanuel, it's in the call, to ISSB, I would say, look, there are more than 40 taxonomies being developed across the world. And some of them, like it's the case of Colombia or South Africa, the UK, and others, are thinking of going that one step further and start looking at how taxonomy reporting would look like for companies. I think the ISSB can play a key role on providing, of course, voluntary, but on providing those indicators on revenues and capex for those taxonomies that are being developed. So if a company is domiciled, for example, in Colombia, that it can use that to report. Yeah, I think that we will be more than happy to provide support on that. We have quite a lot of experience of what works and what doesn't work. But I think that will be, a first great step. In terms of internationally on the actual taxonomy becoming much more standardized, which is one of the key points, right? Also put on the table, there is the International Platform on Sustainable Finance that is doing that. So basically trying to look at how to harmonize the actual taxonomy. From my perspective, before going into, instead of trying to say, where does the world need to put the threshold, whether it's 100 grams or 120 grams, right? I think it's more important to agree on the structure, the principles, the underlying metrics, and that those underlying metrics are the same. And then we have the reporting indicators, and we can then move to a world maybe of an exchange rate almost, right? So £1, €1, $1, €1, if you follow what I'm trying to say. So basically, let's think more about what needs to be shared of that structure of those environmental metrics and have the indicators common, and then let every jurisdiction decide what is important for them and where they want to set the threshold. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helena. And of course, I was asking impossible to ask for an overview and to address one point. Okay, that's stupid of me, but thank you for your explanation. And I would like to turn to Representative John Sarbanes. Please, John.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just say at the outset that I'm way over my head in this company of experts on the topics. So forgive me if my questions sound a little bit uneducated here. But what I was interested in is, obviously you've discussed all the many ways in which we can try to encourage a more efficient flow of capital into clean energy and sustainable energy investment and so forth. And a key part of that is developing this language, these taxonomies, as I guess I understand it, creating standardized platforms of information and transparency to motivate people to invest wisely, or give them the tools by which they can invest wisely. What I was curious about is whether, as you think about this project, there are specific target audiences that you are prioritizing to, in a sense, get on board first because of the positions of influence they hold, their positions within certain finance ecosystems, et cetera, so that they become evangelists on behalf of this overall endeavor here, or whether you're just shooting to create that set of uniform platforms and reference points and then kind of push it out simultaneously in all directions. So if that question makes sense, please let me know your thoughts on that.
Answer myself. Maybe Nathan Fabian is also online. Nathan, you work with institutional investors. Are they the ambassadors? And can you give more broadly the answer to the question by John Sarbanes?
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. There I am. Okay, good to be with you. Thanks for the presentations. So investors, I'd say, widely support and deeply support a global baseline of accounting standards because they're concerned about capital market function, and their capital deployment risk management steps are a critical foundation for their work. That's the first thing. So are they evangelists for that? Well, investors tend not to be evangelical about anything, but they're deeply supportive. I think what we're also seeing is that, as Emmanuel in a way highlighted, some jurisdictions are being more ambitious with their 2030 climate and nature targets. And so it's starting to create a deeper transition curve for a lot of emitting and polluting sectors. And so investors are thinking about, how do you set targets? How do you address transition risks in your portfolios when there are quite deep cuts in emissions required? And I think this is what's leading us to have tools like taxonomies, for example, because investors are looking for additional tools beyond the capital market accounting standard basis in order to judge how well companies are going to transition their balance sheets. Now, some investors are very keen on these tools and have created working spaces to test them and use them. And we have, I think, the alliances of asset owners and investment managers are the ones who are showing us the way on how to deal with target setting, sectoral transition planning, emissions reduction targets at the portfolio level, application of taxonomies, application of climate benchmarks, thinking quite carefully about what they're claiming around risk and investment opportunity and what they can do. So there are these, let's call them pockets of advanced practice, and they're related to jurisdictions that are moving quicker on their emissions reduction and nature goals. And so And maybe, Paul, in the spirit of the conversation, I can finish my response with a question which would go to Emmanuel's point. And that would be, how far do we think the accounting standards will take us on the disclosures of issuers when we have 20, 30 targets that are actually quite deep? Do we think that's going to be enough, or is there actually still this additional set of tools that are going to be required, as I believe there probably are, but I'd be very interested in his view. So Paul, does that do the job for now?
Thank you, Nathan. A good question, John. Really good question. Emmanuel, could you take on the question by Nathan and Fabian quickly? That would be wonderful.
I'll try my best. Yes, I think the transition cannot happen if there are not two things: very clear public policies that are clear on the incentive, clear on the objectives, and clear on the incentives. And of course, sustainable finance taxonomies are here to exactly create that. Elena's challenge is, can that be as global as possible? The answer is yes, of course, we'd love that, but we can really discuss why it's going to be difficult and why, therefore, it's very essential that accounting provides the granular data. I'll just give one example of that, which is that when during winter 22, suddenly in Europe, there were discussions about the status of natural gas. Is that a brown or a blue, and finally a transitional thing? We cannot afford, as a global language, to be subject to those taxonomies that are subject to policy issues. So what we are currently requesting is for each company in each country their exact energy mix, so that then taxonomies can be filled with this granular, accurate information, and then design the appropriate incentives. So that's the first thing I'd say. The other thing is, as Nathan just said, you cannot succeed only with policies. You need to succeed with markets being put at work there. And this is where the language that hopefully the CSRD and ourselves are, and what the efforts in the US currently are providing together, will help the market to actually do its fair share, which I think should be an absolutely fundamental mainstream share of the work, with appropriate incentive by the public policies.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And in this round of speakers, I would like to lastly turn to Petros Koskales, a colleague from the European Parliament. Petros?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having this transatlantic conversation. I was very much intrigued by the way that Sean framed the argument. I have heard the argument from John Kerry that we are witnessing the opening of the biggest market in the history of markets. Now, the argument that we're witnessing the biggest wealth transfer in the history of the species is very interesting, as well, of course, as the dollars per BTU. But I also really, what caught my eye was the article at the Harvard Law Journal of the Sustainable Investment Caucus, warning about the politicization of the metrics we're discussing here. Florida, of all places, which of course you refer to the moratorium and the evaporation of home insurance due to climate change, asking or inquiring into the fiduciary duty of the state treasurer not using ESG. And of course, that's where one of the presidential candidates, I assume, is running from. And we are having elections in 2024 in the United States and in Europe as well, where we face headwinds and pushbacks towards the green agenda. On the 100 trillion of equity, of which we need 2% to move the needle, this number seems to be very much used around lately. Of course, it is the percentage of the USA GDP that was used for the Marshall Plan post-World War II. And of course, it's very much the number that's being discussed at the ahead of the COP28 discussions for loss and damage and North and South, as you want to call it, reparations or investment. So my question mostly to Sean, I guess, is how do you guys view the whole discussion about the climate Bretton Woods and the need for international reform, the reform of international financial architecture, and how do we, guard off this pushback besides winning the elections?
This is also a very good question. I look at Serpa. Do we have time to take a question? Are we allowed to, or?
I think that we are allowed. It's so important.
Okay, it's a good question. So, and I think the question was directed to Nathan, right? Did I have that correctly?
Sean.
Sorry, to Sean. Okay.
So I must say, with a lot of my colleagues on the call, I want to be careful not to speak for everybody. I think we are all keenly aware, and it's been, I think it's been the subtext of a lot of COPs that we are aware of this massive tension between what should be a fairly easy payment relative to the size of the U.S. economy with respect to loss and damages and the developing world and the countries that are at risk of washing away from sea level rise, and the massive political intractability of that in the current environment. And I think it's created a situation where a lot of our diplomats have struggled to both acknowledge the moral imperative and not make promises they can't deliver on, and that's sad. I would share, and I may have made this comment to some of you when you visited our climate committee, I think about a year and a half ago, that sometimes I think that the United States, if we really commit to this, could play a remarkable leadership position in the world, because we have communities that are completely dependent on energy production, and we have communities that are completely dependent on access to cheap energy. We don't have the kind of situation in Europe where the energy production is generally done elsewhere, and so you can externalize some of that pain. We have communities, as you mentioned, in the Gulf Coast and Florida. I mean, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has said that sea level rise is going to lead to 2 feet of sea level rise in the Gulf Coast by 2050. You would be a fool to invest in properties in Matt Gaetz's congressional district if you have access to a topographical map. And I think the challenge we have is that right now we have viewed those stresses in the United States as people from other climate stressed countries are coming here, and we can turn this into xenophobia of those people from Honduras and Nicaragua that are being hit by climate change, the people from Northern Africa who are seeing desertification. If we just clamp up our borders, we'll be okay. As I tell my Chicago area constituents, at some point y'all are going to be real upset about the fact that these older people who just suck off our social security network are going to be living in Miami Beach and saying, I kind of like those Great Lakes and all that water in your distance from the sea. And that internal migration, is going to start coming along as well. And if we can find a way to deal honestly with that as a country and say, okay, how do we deal with these inequities and do it in a way that recognizes that we're going to create a tremendous amount of wealth. This isn't a question of being able to afford it. This is a question of, are we going to make sure that that wealth we create is allocated equitably in our society, or is it only going to accrue to the people who invested the capital? And if we can solve that, I think we can play a role on the world stage to say the same way that we owe decency and dignity to people on the Gulf Coasts who are both exposed to climate change and dependent on an industry that's going away. We also owe decency and dignity to Iranians or Bangladeshis. We ain't there yet, but I sure hope we can get there.
Well, Sam, thank you. I think that this sounds very promising, and if I only could I hope that we could sort of continue this discussion and have maybe this kind of a series of discussions how to push the agenda forward in the both parts of the globe, quite literally, on USA and in Europe. And if I try to draw together some of the comments, first of all, I think that we should try to sketch a roadmap that would be sort of shared with the progressive Congress persons in the USA and among ourselves. That would mean what kind of a reporting systems, what needs to happen, and how to support the ISSB, how to raise the level of the taxonomy, how to put it in credit rating agencies, how to create the credible data. And when there was the question about who is the audience, I think that our best friends is the financial community that is getting the point, as we can hear. So we should have a very good contact with that one. And for the progressive companies that are going to look forward and being competitive on these new terms, and then of course trying to create a caucus of politicians working for this in EU and in USA, plus then try to have a bigger political caucus that has the sort of a positive message that yes, we do have the money, yes, this can be a competitive edge, yes, we can do it. Now I'm sort of a feeling that I'm quoting someone from the past history on that side. And we would need to look the financial side, but also the public side. So the subsidies, how do we measure our GDP? What do we put our public funding from our budgets? How can we sort of change the system? And then maybe with that kind of an effort, we could push it forward in the COPs, in our difficult political environments in both sides. I'm really sort of challenged and slightly worried about the upcoming elections in the EU. You know, our challenges, and I know a bit of your challenges too. And so there's the big way and work to be done. But hey, this is what the politics is for, and I'm great to have you as colleagues and companions to work for the better world.
Good.
And is there anything what anyone acutely wants to add? Sean, were these your final words, or do you want to add something?
This is John Sarbanes. I wanted to just echo what Sean said, which was totally on point. And certainly there's no substitute for an overarching framework at the national level in terms of commitments to these and sustainable, the putting a regime in place that will drive all of that. Having said that, given the negative branding nationally that we're contending with around this clean energy transition, I do think there's opportunity sort of in the meantime or alongside our work to change that, to lift up initiative that's happening at other levels of jurisdiction, at the state level, at local level, and maybe even to get back to this idea of target audiences, but in a different context, focus some of the information platforms and other things into certain communities around the country, including in places that are getting unfairly hijacked by this larger political frame, to show the benefit of staying focused on this transition. And it's not unlike what happened when we dropped out of the Paris Accords for a while, but you had mayors, governors, local commissioners who signed on to those commitments and continued to push forward the general set of objectives, even in the face of that. So I think there may be some opportunities there that fall under the kind of political banner, but can occur at another level and provide some kind of counter to that.
Thank you very much, and this was a positive note to end the discussion. Thank you, my colleagues from the USA side and from the European side. Have a very good day, evening, and whatever time zone you happen to be in. We'll be in contact. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.